There is a conversation happening right now, somewhere inside you, that no one else will ever hear. Maybe it started this morning. Maybe it started years ago and never really stopped. Someone said something to you, or didn't say something, and your mind picked it up quietly, carried it into a back room, and started building. A response, a scene, an entire world where things went differently, where you finally said the thing you never got to say, where someone finally understood you the way you always needed to be understood. And the strange thing is, it felt real. Not like pretending, not like playing make-believe the way children do. It felt like breathing, like returning to something. Like the only place in the entire day where you could finally exhale. If you know exactly what that feels like, not from curiosity, but from memory, then stay with me. Because what I'm about to describe isn't a flaw in your character. It isn't laziness or immaturity or a lack of discipline. It is, in the most literal sense, the most intelligent thing your nervous system ever learned to do. And the fact that it's slowly costing you something, costing you time, costing you presence, costing you the real life that keeps passing on the other side of the window, doesn't cancel out that truth. It just means we need to look at it more honestly than anyone ever has before. So let's do that. Let's start with what's actually happening, not the surface version, not the everyone daydreams sometimes dismissal that people offer when they don't really want to understand. That kind of response is the emotional equivalent of someone handing you a Band-Aid while you're describing surgery. What we're talking about is something far more layered, something that doesn't just visit you, it lives with you. It has a geography. It has recurring characters, storylines that evolve over months, emotional arcs that feel more complete than most real relationships ever manage to be. Psychologist Ellie Summer at the University of Haifa spent years studying people who described this exact pattern and gave it a name, maladaptive daydreaming. But the name, honestly, barely touches it. Maladaptive makes it sound like a malfunction, a glitch, like your brain did something wrong and you need to correct it. But when you actually sit with the stories people tell, the hours lost, the worlds built, the characters who feel like family, what you hear isn't dysfunction. What you hear is someone who was deeply, profoundly underserved by reality and found a way to survive it anyway. That matters. That changes everything about how we look at this. Your brain has a network, the default mode network, that activates the moment your attention releases its grip on the external world. The second you stop focusing on a task, on a screen, on a conversation, this network lights up and begins doing something extraordinary. It starts generating you, your memories, your fears, your unfinished emotional business. It takes the raw material of your life and begins to process it, simulate it, rehearse it. And for most people, this happens occasionally in the shower, on a walk, in the minutes before sleep. But for some people, something shifted. The brain learned not through conscious decision, but through repeated experience that the internal world was safer than the external one, more rewarding, more responsive, more like home. And once that learning locked in, everything changed. The default mode network stopped being a background process and became the main event. Reality started to feel like the interruption. Now think about what that actually means for a moment. Think about what the real world would have had to feel like for your brain to make that calculation. Because brains are not random, they don't drift toward internal simulation for no reason. They do it because at some point, possibly many points, the external world offered something painful when you needed something safe. Or it offered nothing when you needed something. Or it offered connection in theory while delivering loneliness in practice. Maybe you grew up in a house where the emotional temperature was unpredictable, where love was present but conditional, where you learned very early that the safest version of yourself was the quiet one, the accommodating one, the one who processed everything internally because processing it externally came with consequences. So your mind became a room, a private room that no one else had access to. And in that room, you could be every version of yourself. You were never allowed to be outside of it. Or maybe there was no single dramatic event. Maybe it was something quieter and more corrosive, what psychologists sometimes describe as micro-trauma. The accumulation of 1,000 small moments where you felt invisible, where you spoke and no one quite heard you, where you tried to connect and the other person was slightly, consistently unreachable. Microtrauma doesn't leave obvious marks. It doesn't give you a clean story to tell. It just slowly, methodically teaches you that the gap between what you need and what the world provides is too large to keep asking across. So you stopped asking across it, and you started building inside it instead. There's a concept in attachment theory called the internal working model, the mental blueprint you develop in early life about how relationships work, whether people can be trusted, whether your needs are worth expressing. If the people around you were responsive and attuned, your internal working model says, reality is where good things happen. Go toward people, ask for what you need. But if the people around you were absent, critical, unpredictable, or simply too overwhelmed by their own pain to be fully present, your internal working model learns something different. It learns that the risk-to-reward ratio of real connection is not in your favor, and so the mind, being the extraordinary adaptive machine that it is, begins to offer you a workaround. The imagined scenario, the rehearsed conversation where the other person finally gets it. The fantasy where you're finally chosen, finally understood, finally standing in a room where your full self is not just tolerated but genuinely wanted. The internal narrative that gives you, with perfect precision, the exact emotional experience that real life kept almost delivering but never quite landing. And this is where it becomes important to stop and say something clearly. That is not weakness. That is not escapism in the shallow sense of the word. That is your mind doing something genuinely remarkable under conditions of genuine deprivation. The daydream is not evidence of what's wrong with you. It is evidence of how creatively, stubbornly, quietly determined you were to survive. But here's what happens next, and this is the part that starts to matter. The brain learns. That's its whole job. It takes what works and makes it automatic. And so, if the imagined world consistently delivers emotional satisfaction, control, resolution, intimacy, the feeling of being deeply known, the brain begins to prefer it. Not because you're broken, but because you taught it that this is where relief lives, and the brain, like water, always moves toward where it has found relief before. Over time, the real world starts to feel thin by comparison, not because it is thin, but because it requires something the imagined world never does. It requires you to tolerate uncertainty. It requires you to be seen by actual people whose responses you cannot write in advance. It requires the terrifying, slow, completely unscripted process of real intimacy, which is nothing like the clean emotional arc of a fantasy. Real connection involves misunderstandings. It involves someone not responding the way you needed. It involves sitting with the ache of being partially known rather than completely known, and choosing to stay anyway. The daydream never asks that of you. In the daydream, you are always the author. You always know how it ends. And so the pull deepens, not dramatically, not all at once. It's more like a tide that comes in so gradually you don't notice how far from shore you've drifted until you turn around and can barely see the land anymore. You stop fully arriving in conversations because part of your mind is already composing the better version of this conversation that you'll have in your head later. You sit in rooms full of people and feel the familiar undertow, not because you're antisocial, not because you don't want connection, but because the version of connection that exists in your inner world has become, through years of careful construction, more emotionally precise than anything the messy, unpredictable external world has offered you yet. And then there is the shame. This is the part that almost never gets spoken aloud. Because what do you say? I spent 3 hours this afternoon in a conversation that never happened with a person who has no idea I was thinking about them. The people who experience this most intensely are often among the most self-aware, most emotionally intelligent people in any room. They know the time is passing. They feel with uncomfortable clarity the gap between where they are and where they feel they should be. And that awareness doesn't make the pull weaker, it actually feeds it. Because shame is one of the most reliable emotional triggers for retreat, and retreat, by now, has a very specific address inside your mind. So the cycle deepens. The shame creates discomfort. The discomfort triggers the need for relief. The relief lives in the inner world. The inner world grows richer as the outer world grows more distant. And somewhere in the background, the actual texture of a real life, messy, frustrating, occasionally devastating, occasionally more beautiful than anything you could have scripted, keeps accumulating without you fully in it. This is not a personality flaw. This is not a character defect. This is the specific shape that survival takes when a sensitive, perceptive, emotionally rich person has been consistently underserved by the world they were handed. But here is the question I want to leave sitting with you right at this edge. If the daydream was the solution, what was the problem it was solving? Not in the abstract, not in theory, in your specific, particular, irreplaceable life. What was so consistently unavailable to you in reality that your mind had to construct it elsewhere? What need was so persistent and so unmet that you built an entire architecture of imagination just to feel it, even briefly, even privately, even alone? Because the answer to that question is the exact place where healing begins, not in the elimination of the inner world, not in forcing yourself back into reality through sheer willpower and self-discipline, the way people suggest when they don't truly understand what this is, but in the slow, honest excavation of what that inner world was always trying to give you, and then, gradually, with great patience for yourself, beginning to ask for some of that out loud. Because here is what the research quietly points toward, and what I think some part of you already suspects. The imagination was never the enemy. The silence around the need was. You didn't build those worlds because something was missing inside you. You built them because something was missing around you and you were too young, or too unseen, or too afraid of the answer to go looking for it anywhere else. The fantasy version of connection felt safer than the real version because the real version had already disappointed you in ways you never fully named. The rehearsed conversation felt more satisfying than the actual one because, in reality, people don't always rise to the moment. They miss it, they misread you, they give you something almost right, and almost right, after a while, starts to feel crueler than nothing at all. So you went inward, and there is no version of that story where you were wrong to do it. But you are here now, older, more aware, reading the map of yourself with slightly more light than you had before. And the question is no longer, why did this happen? The question is, what do you want to build next? Not instead of the inner world, alongside it, start small, embarrassingly small. One real conversation where you say the thing you would normally only say in your head. One moment where you let someone see, I need instead of quietly meeting it yourself in imagination. One step back toward the friction and the uncertainty and the beautiful, devastating unpredictability of being genuinely known by another person. The depth you carry is real. It always was. If this video felt less like content and more like recognition, you are not alone in this. Consider subscribing. There's more waiting for you here.